All right, so for this screencast, we're going to be looking at the new rubric that was just published a few days ago for the argumentative essay for this take-home exam coming up on May 11th. First of all, one change, as you can see, 7 points is the point total for question for the argumentative essay. The content application question is worth 3 points. We'll talk about that in another video. But first of all, just be aware that's different. Prior to this, it was 6 points. So let's look at where the point's coming from. You get 1 point, the first point, for a thesis statement that responds to the prompt with a defensible claim that establishes a line of reasoning. So very, very important that it establishes a line of reasoning. I don't know why that's not highlighting. Okay. If you don't have a line of reasoning established, you are not setting up your response so that you get the rest of the points. So as we talked about in class, this is a 1 point portion of the essay. That's really the key to getting all the rest of the points. So if you mess up the argumentative essay, it has really, really bad consequences. Although, if you go through the rubric, you're going to find that it is possible to earn some of those other points. So looking at the comments, responses that do not earn this point, the intended claim or thesis only restates the prompt. So you cannot just restate the prompt. That is a big no-no. The intended claim or thesis does not make a claim that responds to the prompt. So perhaps you're just rambling about something else, and maybe the prompt set off a line of reasoning in your mind, and it turns out not to be relevant. So just make sure that whatever your thesis statement is answers the question in the prompt and establishes a line of reasoning. Responses that do earn the point, they respond to the prompt rather than restating or rephrasing the prompt, and very important, establish a line of reasoning. So as we've talked about, that word because, or some sort of transitional phrase in that, therefore, maybe not therefore, but I think if we stick with because, we're going to have good results. Okay, additional notes. Claim or thesis must consist of one or more sentences that may be located anywhere in the response. So those of you that have difficulty in writing, you can still get points. They're not going to deduct points just because you wrote a scatterbrain type of response. But we're going to practice doing ones that are formulaic so that you can all make sure that you get those points. Okay, secondly, a claim or thesis that meets the criteria can be awarded the point whether or not the rest of the response successfully supports that line of reasoning. So your thesis statement is an island unto itself. If you write it correctly, you're going to get the point. So be aware of that. Evidence, 0 through 4 points. This is different. I'm glad it's different because the old version had some ridiculous, you get 2 points, but it's really 3 if you do this or this, and it was very confusing. This is very clear. Okay. Evidence has to back up your claim. So if you can get 1 or 2 points if you provide one piece of evidence that is accurate, relevant to the topic of the prompt. So 1 if you do 1, 2 if you do 2, makes sense. The third point, you must provide 2 pieces of specific and relevant evidence and use 1 piece to support the claim or thesis. 2 pieces of specific and relevant evidence and use 1 of those pieces to support the thesis. And then the fourth point is if you use 2 pieces of evidence that are specific and relevant that support the claim. So basically, if you have, to use kind of the old framework we talked about, 2 pieces of evidence and one of them is accurate, the other one is not. This kind of makes it a little bit more clear. To get all 4 points, you have to use 2 pieces of evidence that are specific and relevant that support the claim or thesis. That's the key. Responses that don't earn a point: you didn't provide any accurate evidence. You provide evidence that is not relevant to the topic, so that's going to get you 0 points. Responses that earn 3 points: provide 2 specific pieces of evidence relevant to the prompt. One of these pieces must support the claim. The evidence may come from one of the foundational documents or any other foundational document from knowledge of course concepts. Responses that earn 4 points: you simply do what you did for the third one, only you do it twice. So 2 pieces of specific and relevant evidence. One must come from a foundational document listed. The other piece can come from a different foundational document, but again, to get both points, this is the important feature. And this is exactly why we're going to spend a lot of time in the next few weeks hammering the Federalist Papers and Brutus I, and of course the Constitution. Okay, additional notes for 2020. 2 points will be awarded for students who provide 2 examples of evidence relevant to the topic of the prompt. So this is a modification just because it's a take-home exam. To earn 3 or 4 points in row B, the response must have a defensible claim or thesis. In other words, the point that was earned in row A. To earn 4 points, the response must use one of the foundational documents listed in the prompt. Row C, reasoning, is worth 2 points. And if you don't use any reasoning at all, obviously no points, but 1 point if you explain how or why one piece of evidence supports the claim or thesis. 2 points if you explain how or why 2 pieces of evidence support the claim or thesis. So I don't know why they have to make this so complicated. If you have reasoning to support you have to have a reasoning to support each of your pieces of evidence. Okay, so this is the why. This is where examples are good, as we talked about in class. But this is where you go into some depth. Okay, this is going to, you're going to have recommended, I think, a good portion of the time of the 45 minutes on this exam devoted to this response. The concept application, I think you're going to find, is pretty straightforward. Okay, responses that don't earn the point include evidence but offer no reasoning to connect the evidence to the claim or thesis, or they restate the prompt without explaining how the evidence supports the claim or thesis. So I have taught it's okay to restate the prompt as a way to stay on course in your thesis statement, provided that you follow it up with what your assertion is and with a line of reasoning attached to that. You know, you got to be real careful because graders are going to be looking for answers that simply restate the prompt, and they're going to probably be not too excited about those types of responses. So we'll practice that as we get closer to the exam. Responses that earn 1 point for reasoning, you have to explain the relationship between the evidence provided and the claim or thesis for at least one piece of evidence. So it's all about the relationship between your evidence and the thesis statement. This is what connects the evidence to your thesis statement. Okay? So, for example, using the recently assigned argumentative essay, if you think the Supreme Court is more responsible for advancing equality, the evidence you could use would be, for example, in the Brown versus Board of Education case, the court ruled expressly on the meaning of the Equal Protection Clause. Their interpretation resulted in a dramatic change in how we view matters of equality, particularly with regard to race. So that's just kind of an example of how reasoning works, something that, use the 14th Amendment as your evidence, which has the Equal Protection Clause. The courts interpret the 14th Amendment using judicial review, and a specific example that shows how the court provided equality. Responses that earn 2 points must explain the relationship between the evidence provided and the claim or thesis for at least 2 pieces of evidence. In other words, if you have reasoning for both, you get all of the points. So the reasoning point prior to this was kind of a mystery. You got 1 reasoning point if you used any reasoning at all in your essay. This one, they're tying the reasoning for each of the points that you have to make, okay? So additional notes to earn 1 or 2 points. The response must have a defensible claim or thesis. So if you did not earn the point in row A, you cannot get reasoning points. This is why, once again, you must establish a line of reasoning. You have to have that because. Okay. Also note, and I think I mentioned this already, but the alternative perspective is not part of the picture in this particular administration. I think they're concerned about time, and probably with 2 questions, one of them being an argumentative essay, they thought it was probably just too much. So we don't know what's going to mean for next year. Not that any of you care, but for this year, you don't have to worry about it. So all of the griping I did it, many of you, well, you're off the hook, okay? So there you go. That's a look at the scoring for the new format